Yeah, I'll just do my telling people to sit. Hello everybody. We just are letting the Zoom audience into the room, so I thought I would interject here while we still have our tropical music going, and the phones are being turned off, I think, and everybody is grabbing their glasses of wine. But I thought that I'd take this moment to welcome people who are coming in via Zoom. So they are all piling into the Zoom room. There's like another lot of you all on that camera. So welcome to the people on the camera, and welcome to everybody here. Now, before we get started today, we do have, well, one bit of housekeeping for the people here is that we do have a toilet for you guys to use, and it's upstairs. So if you can always creep behind the counter if you're at the back there and head upstairs. So that's where the toilet is, upstairs along the corridor. Also, if you want to tweet tonight, we are at avidreader4101, and feel free to tweet. And the other thing is about the leaves that I handed people. So for everybody who's just joining us on Zoom, and I'm hoping you can all see our faces because I am now standing here and I can't adjust my camera. But for everyone who is joining us here on Zoom, I handed out leaves from a packet that I had brought with me, and I found a tree that looked very much like a gum tree this morning, and I thought I will just get as many leaves from this gum tree as are people coming to this event. And so everyone has a leaf, and in fact it might be good for my Twitter to get a photograph of you all holding up your leaf. So let's hold up our leaves. All right, so here we have leaves. Now, I want a hands up if you think these are gum leaves. Hands up if there's a couple of people bravely. I really did think it looked like a gum tree and they look like gum leaves. And I don't quite know why they're not.
I'm just wondering if you've got leaf recognition blindness, like your facial recognition blindness.
It's possible. So I would love after this event to have somebody come and tell me why I have got this so terribly wrong. They do look gum leaf shaped, and the tree itself looked really kind of gum leaf shaped as a tree. And the only other gum tree in my backyard was a ghost gum, and their leaves don't look like gum leaves.
But was it a gum?
It is a ghost gum, but it had leaves on it, but they were tiny, and I was like, these pissy little leaves don't look like gum leaves. So I got the ones that looked like gum leaves. Anyway, there's a few scientists entering the room, and no doubt they will tell me what is wrong with my, I've got the thumbs down from the scientist over there. So yes, we know that there's a problem with my gum recognition, and we can discuss that after this event. Now, so on that note, I think we've just welcomed everybody, and I'd like to kick off proceedings tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. And I'd also like to mention that you guys joining us on Zoom are joining us mostly, although there might be some international people, but mostly from Aboriginal lands. And so I'd like to acknowledge the elders on the lands that you're joining us from. This is Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. And I think that reading this book has, hammered that home again to me. I did know that I was standing on Aboriginal land, but at every point, at every turn in this book, we realised that there were people who just stomped all over a country that already had people living here and caring for landscape and caring very deeply for the trees as people in that landscape. So that's another beautiful reason to read this book or to potentially put it on order. Because 'tis the season. We have ordered 3 lots of event stock for this book. 2 of them got stuck in the great big debacle that has been the delivery service leading up to Christmas. And the 3rd box arrived today in West End in Townsville. I don't know what's at 172 West End in Townsville, but I think possibly.
I lived there 35 years ago.
Well, do you know what's at 172 Boundary Street, West End in Townsville?
I don't know, but I lived in that neighbourhood.
Probably a florist is now unpacking a box of books called Gum. Now I think that we have some Zoom problems, or we're all right?
We're all too short, we're all too tall.
Okay, cool.
It's not great.
Anyway, while they're dealing with the Zoom, I would like to start by introducing who we have tonight. You'll notice that there's 3 people on the stage tonight, which is not very normal, but it is very normal for Chris Olsson, Ashley Hay and myself, because prior to COVID, Chris and Ashley and I were quite an amazing writing team, and we would meet very regularly to discuss craft, to discuss the books that we were writing or not writing, which is another story in itself. And we decided that our launches would sometimes operate a little bit like our conversations over coffee. And so now we're having another one of those conversations over coffee, only with wine and with all of you. So what we're doing today is a little bit less formal than our normal launches, but it's more like a conversation between friends about a really important book that has headed our way. So I'm going to do a big introduction for Ashley because she's amazing. Ashley Hay has been praised, her work has been praised as scintillating and accomplished and illuminated by incandescent intelligence and a rare sensibility. She is the author of 4 novels. One almost got published into the world and then got snaffled by a day job. The Body in the Clouds, The Railwayman's Wife, and 100 Small Lessons, all amazing reads. I can recommend all highly. And 4 works of non-fiction, including Gum, which was first published in 2002 and is now republished again this year. And we'll get into why a little bit later. She has been operating as the editor of the Griffith Review. And as in that role,
That sounds like a covert operation.
it does. So you might be off. You might be off. We might need to turn you on. It's just at the top there. Whoop. Yeah. It's up. It's on. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
So she's been, covertly operating as the editor of the Griffith Review, and in that time she has produced a pile of books that have taken her output into the stratosphere, I think.
How many, Ash? How many?
I think tomorrow, the 14th of mine is going to print.
I think a round of applause. 14 Griffith Reviews. That's no small task. So I do need to wait a little bit for my 4th novel to come, but I'm waiting patiently. And in the meantime, I have this to go on with, this book that has now been put out into the world. Ashley has won a lot of prizes and been shortlisted for many, including the Miles Franklin. She is an incredible writer and an incredible friend. So please welcome Ashley Hay. And to my far right is Kristina Olsson, a multi-award-winning author of fiction and non-fiction. Her books include In One's Skin, The China Garden, Shell and Boy Lost. She teaches a very popular memoir workshop, in fact, at Avid Reader, and it fills up like crazy every year. And I think we only have a few places left for her one for next year. We had to divide it into 2 groups. So if you are interested, get on it very quickly. And of course, I'm Krissy Kneen, the author of a bunch of books, including The 3 Burials of Lottie Kneen. And I am going to I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Kristina Olsson to kick us off.
That's me. Thank you, Krissy. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place. We're so lucky to be meeting on tonight. to acknowledge their long history here in storytelling, of course, as well as custodianship of this place. If only we'd kept doing what they were doing all that time. And we have had, you know, haven't we, since we've been here, this very vexed relationship with the eucalypt. When we're outside on nights like this, I have to say, when the weather seems to be coming in, we run away from the widow makers, as they're called. Anyone who's been under a eucalypt with a slightly shaky branch will know that singular terror. And other times we can walk for miles, as Sally Piper and I do quite often, around the Dagular National Park, stopping every 10 minutes to put our hands on a particular kind of bark. Really giving thanks for what extraordinary trees they are. But really don't take my word for this. I would rather Tim Flannery say something about this book that we're going to talk about tonight in the New York Review of Books. Oh my God, yes. And Tim says, and Tim, as we know, is reliable, the book's great strength, and he means gum, the book's great strength comes from the unfolding sense of Australia's national identity that somehow crystallises around the eucalyptus tree. And that's what we get. The writer herself, Ashley Hay, to my left, who managed to bring this book together, this extraordinary book, I think you described it, Ash, as, what did you describe it as? Magic, mythical, and something else, which I've forgotten. At any rate, Ash really summed up her own book very well. Anyway, I'm going to get straight to questions now. Ash, I want you to take us back more than 20 years, to the closing decade of the millennium, when you picked up your pen to write Gum. You were, and still are, a journalist, and you just published a book about, quote, the strange marriage of Annabella Milbank and Lord Byron, described as engrossing and compulsive, but not perhaps of a horticultural bent, shall we say. So what happened between writing The Secret and this book? And what I want to know is how this book was born in your head.
There's a really nice straight line between Lord Byron and Gum, which is not obvious to many. But the simple answer is that what happened was I came home. So I worked on the book about Lord Byron when I was living in the UK, and I lived over there for a few years, like Australians used to get to do, and we could move around the world. And I came home to finish The Secret, and got off the plane in Sydney Airport and headed south to where my mum and dad live on the south coast of New South Wales. I went through Royal National Park, and for some reason driving through Royal National Park, it was really early in the morning, and I started thinking about things that I'd read, I don't know why or where. I think actually I do. I think it was maybe in a book that Tim Flannery had written, a sort of compendium of early colonial responses to the landscape. And a lot of those people had been pretty nonplussed by the trees that they found here and the colours and the behaviour of the trees. They thought it was really weird that the trees lost their bark and not their leaves. That was all wrong. And we were driving through Royal National Park in the morning, and the landscape was so beautiful. And I started to think about how differently I was seeing exactly the same landscape as these Europeans had seen, and why had it looked so alien to them, and why hadn't they been able to see what was actually here. And I started thinking, I guess, about a way of, as someone who'd been away from Australia for a few years, a way of exploring Australia through a different kind of prism. And I wondered what sort of history you would get, what sort of history you could make for post-settlement, post-colonial settler Australia, if you looked at that history through the prism of the eucalypts.
There you are.
I think jet lag might have had something to do with it.
And really, when you think about it, certainly my generation's parents were really still referring to the UK as home, and that landscape is a very different one. And so we were brought up thinking that it was a very straggly landscape. It was, you know, a little bit shifty and a little bit untidy. And we like tidiness.
Definitely untidy and the wrong colour. It took a long time. My mum's a visual artist, and years ago she told me a great story about someone coming from Europe and trying to paint the sky in Australia, and how long it took him to understand that the reason he couldn't get it right was because he was using the wrong blue to start with. And I think there was maybe a bit of that for a lot of the earliest artists, and not just the earliest artists. I mean, they wanted how we understand things as humans, and this is a big problem when you think about it, is we sort of do this game of compare and contrast all the time. How can I make this person look like someone I know, or how can I make this thing feel a bit familiar? It's how the whole sort of system of taxonomy works. You know, how you classify a plant is by saying, well, it's sort of like this, so I think it's going to be in this genus and maybe this family. And it's this whole sort of balancing and recalibrating, but always with a point of reference to something familiar. So if you arrive in the landscape of Australia in 1770 into a completely complex arrangement of nations and cultures and law and story and tradition and knowledge, and you're just trying to look at it in the context of what you understand from the other side of the world, you can sort of see how you're getting off on the wrong foot.
Yeah. I'm going to throw to Krissy Kneen now, but I just want to say, so this is what impelled you to write about gum trees. Something else.
It was literally wanting to explore why they'd looked so alien and not beautiful. I think that was honestly the starting point. And then it was about trying to find a different way to explore the stories we tell about Australia. And it was, you know, I think I'd been away for 3 years, so it wasn't a long time, but it was sort of enough time for things to have changed. But I'm not sure how cognizant of all the layers of it, and even of that idea of how we understand new things. I don't think I was as cognizant of that when the book first came out in 2002 as I am now.
It's a decent amount of time.
Yes.
I think what you were saying about, you know, the look of the colour and how alien that is really interesting, actually, because also from a family of artists and being brought up, they were saying there was nothing as beautiful as the Australian landscape. When they came here, they loved it so much. It was so beautiful. The light was so beautiful. And yet when I went to Europe for the first time, I suddenly went, oh, gee, well, our photos are really flattering and everything looks great because it's got such a soft light over there and our light is harsh. So it's hard to capture unless you're in it and immersed and know it.
And I think it would be very hard to capture. I mean, I'm really intrigued by that sort of tiny piece of time when the Endeavour arrives in Botany Bay, and that sort of moment of first contact. It's there for less than a week, and I'm really intrigued by imagining what that must have been like. But even more so, these 12 tiny little ships that, you know, turn up and make such a mess. You know, that early settlement in Sydney for the first few years where the settlement is so cut off from the world, they're starving, they're waiting for news, they're sort of sending all these desperate letters off asking for supplies. They've been sent with a piano. Of course, no gardener, you know, no idea of how to kind of approach this landscape and grow things. It doesn't occur to them that they could have a conversation with the people who've been eating what is growing there for a long time. I mean, those sort of points of rupture and disruption are really fascinating. I mean, they're fascinating as a novelist too. That's where stories happen. So, but I think just how harsh it would have felt and how we know how the story turns out from this vantage point from 2021, or we know where it's run to up till now, but being those people trying to get to grips with where they were and what they were looking at all through the first decades of disruption and settlement, that would have been a really extraordinary piece of time to try to navigate.
Oh, absolutely. And you do it so well in your book. We'll get to the content of the book in a minute. But I think the question that we need to put to you now is why 2021? Why did you need to revisit this book now? And I'm only asking for the audience because having just finished the book, it's very clear to me, but I want to know why you thought it was worth it.
There are two answers, and one's a really pragmatic thing. So, Gum came out in 2002 and did its thing, and that was very nice. And I had always thought, gee, it'd be really amazing to do an exhibition around eucalypts. That'd be really incredible. And at the beginning of this year, two amazing curators from the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, Sarah Rees and Agatha Gertha Snape, got in contact with me. And they said they were designing this show that they wanted to call Eucalyptus, and they wanted to use the amazing collections from the Powerhouse Museum, whose sort of the basis of that museum was an exploration of economic botany. And they wondered if I'd be interested in writing something for the exhibition. And I, said my usual thing of, I've got this job now that's a bit busy. But then they said that everyone involved in the exhibition, and there were all the people at the Powerhouse, and they were commissioning all these other artists, visual artists, writers, musicians, all sorts of people, architects, and they'd given all of these people a copy of Gum, and they were using it like the kind of playbook for the exhibition. And I just found that so amazing that it had this little life out there. And the book's been out of print for a few years, and it was getting hard for them to find secondhand copies. So I said, of course, I'd be delighted to write something, and I worked on that. And then very beautifully, the lovely people at New South, Elspeth Menzies and Kathy Bale, said that they would be interested in reissuing the book and doing a new edition. And that was wonderful because the book, being finished in 2002, there were two things that I was always really conscious weren't in the book. And there were two conversations that weren't really in the public space when I finished writing it. And one was the conversation about climate change, which anybody who has to put up with what I write now knows I do think is pretty much the most important story we can be covering. And the other was genetics and the sort of the DNA level of the trees. So I'd always felt like there was a hole in the story. And in about 2015, I'd written an essay for Australian Book Review that kind of looked at the trees through those two prisms. And I'd always thought it would be really lovely to get to scoop that essay into the book as well. But the other thing that there was the opportunity to do with remaking the book or sticky taping new bits on was to look at some of the thinking that I'd been able to do, and particularly I think through Griffith Review, even though it stopped me doing other things, around how we accommodate, how we make more space for the stories that pre-exist the stories we are telling here, the knowledge that predates the disruption of settlement, how we accommodate those ideas and those realities in the stories that we tell about ourselves. So the greatest gift was being able to bring some of that thinking into the very end of the book in a way that I don't think I would have known how to do, and I don't think I would have felt comfortable doing 20 years ago.
And another wonderful thing that you didn't just, like most people would go, I'll just whack an intro into this and that'll Bob's your uncle, but you actually went through it. This whole, I found these little touches all the way through this book, reading it, that contemporise every single one of those chapters. And I thought that you could give us a little bit of a reading for one of those little moments, actually, that was like a little Easter egg, finding a book that has just been published this year and that I love, turning up in your book from 2002.
Time travel. So this is from the new ending of the book, and yes, it scoops some pretty recent stuff in here, and I'm going to I apologise to Anita Heiss in advance. I'm going to say the title of her book very slowly. One of the most recent things I've read about a gum tree is not science, not history, not anyone's classificatory or botanical endeavour, but the telling of a different kind of truth. This is from Billa Yaradanga Wiradjuri author Anita Heiss's beautiful novel of language, longing, and the Murrumbidgee River's passage through Wiradjuri land, set in colonial 19th century. Early in the book, there's a leave-taking, a daughter travelling away against her will. The older women have moved in closer around her, Anita writes, trying to absorb her distress. The men are preparing a fire to smoke her and themselves, to cleanse away all the worry, the concern, the fear they share about her leaving the clan. The children walk to the centre of the circle with some small branches of eucalyptus leaves, which they have pulled carefully from low-hanging branches, knowing that they are only ever to take what comes easily to them, what the land wants them to have. The respect, the generosity in this sharing, this transfer, this trade. In Northwest Australia, First Nations knowledge has been shared about an integral connection between the Gadga tree, Corymbia polycarpa, and the Gullah-Burraloo people, about the intersection between living country and an understanding of life as networked, sustained among humans and non-humans. Around Broome, people evoke the concept of lian, a feeling for country, as a general concept for multi-species cosmic interaction linked to vitality and growth, which feeds into the multiple modes of belonging that need to be in a place for ceremony to be successful. This concept of mutual sustainability is a long way from how the Gadga is classified botanically, where its being is positioned and identified in the process of translating it into Corymbia polycarpa. The Garrigou scholar and writer Jacqueline Troy speaks to a similar idea when she says, First Peoples worldwide have fundamentally and always understood trees to be community members for us. They are not entities that exist in some biological separateness, given a Linnaean taxonomy and classed with other non-sentient beings. Trees are part of our mob, part of our human world, and active members of our communities with lives, loves, and feelings. When we destroy trees, we destroy ourselves.
Amazing. A small glimpse of how absolutely beautiful the prose in this book is. If you thought that it would be a dry sort of scientific or history book, it is not dry at all. I'll pass over to Kristina.
And neither will your eyes be.
Yeah.
That one made me cry. Krissy and I thought we might just dip into each chapter a little to give you a tiny taste of what you'll get from each part of the book, rather than, just grab bits willy-nilly. So I'm going to start with a question about becoming eucalyptus, Ash. I must say I was pretty excited about your account of Cook's voyage with Banks and Solander up the East Coast. I haven't ever been excited by that story before. And, really?
Sorry, yeah, because the Zoom can't hear in the background.
Hello, Zoom, sorry. And they're seeing gums really for the first time, aren't they? Not thinking about them very much at all, except to note the gummy stuff that sometimes leaks out of bits of the bark, and not naming them either, except for, I'm going to really mess with this, but sanguine trichonis. There you go. Or dragon's blood, as Banks called it, I think, yeah. But by the time they reach what we now call Yarrabah, far north Queensland, he's seen so many of these trees. He writes, most of the trees were gum trees, naming them for the first time. But beyond that, they're pretty unimpressed, I have to say, with everything else. So how did the ubiquitous tree become eucalyptus?
I love this story because Banks goes off around the world with James Cook, and he's a rich young guy, and rich young guys go and they do a tour of Europe, and Banks is determined that he's going to be groovier than all the other young cool cats. And so he gets himself onto James Cook's Endeavour and goes off around the world. And he is a botanist. He's a collector. Actually, he's a collector more than a botanist. He takes Daniel Solander, a botanist, with him, and they collect mountains of stuff, and they take it all back to England. And what should happen then is they should hunker down and they should do the work. They should pull the specimens out and they should write up what these things are and work out how they fit into this catalogue of life that Western science or Western natural history at that point is assembling. But Banks is way too busy being famous. He has no time for this tedious humdrum of 9-to-5 work. And he sort of does the equivalent thing of just stuffing everything under the bed. And he's very happy for other people to come and look at it so that they can be impressed by how much cool stuff he's got. But he just never does the work. And Solander dies and the work doesn't get done. And finally, a Frenchman who's trying to get out of the way of the small matter of the French Revolution in late 1780s comes to England and is an aristocrat. And so he goes to visit Banks to see all the cool stuff like everybody does. And he decides that he wants to write a book which is just about delineating new species of trees. He's not interested in anything small like, a shrub. He just wants the big stuff. And he finds in Banks's collections a specimen of a eucalypt, a specimen of a tree, not from Cook's first voyage, but from one of the later voyages. It's been collected by the Resolution when it's down in Tasmania. And his name is Le Heritier, and Le Heritier starts to classify that tree. And he looks particularly at the sort of gum nut, at the bud of the thing, and he notices the way there's a cap on the top of the bud, and he thinks that it looks well covered. Thank you, Krissy, Kneen. And so he goes not to the Latin, but to the Greek. And so eucalyptus comes from the Greek words for well covered. And so the first eucalyptus is Eucalyptus obliqua, which are those beautiful big gums. This was Bruny Island, this specimen was taken from. And that's the beginning of the genus name. And because it's published, it knocks out any other things that might have been written anywhere else. There have been other names, but they haven't sort of been done properly. And so that's where eucalyptus begins.
Splendid story. Krissy, isn't it?
Yeah. So I have to admit, I was completely wrapped in that in the taxonomy stuff, and I miss my calling. I think just naming and painting things. I think I want to do. But the chapter after that is called the Explorers' Trees, and this is really interesting, particularly because an awful lot of explorers would come and look for rivers that never existed, and that they really did think these things existed, and that the trees became a way of finding water, and this became a giant search for things that never existed.
I know, they're so confident that they know what's somewhere that they've never been. So the particular explorer, who is, again, a character who's a little more vexed to approach in 2022 than he was 20 years ago, is Thomas Mitchell. And he's so sure that there's this mighty river like the Amazon, bigger than the Amazon, he's sure. He's even given it a name before he goes off to try and find it.
What does he call it again?
The Kinder.
That's right. Sounds very
Yeah,
strange.
It's not there, surprisingly.
He made it up.
Well, someone made it up. To be fair to Mitchell, someone did make it up before him, but he's sure that he will find it, and he goes off. Mitchell's really interesting, and this I say this with full acknowledgement of a lot of other parts of his intersection with the landscape and its people that I'm not talking about here. But before he comes to Australia, when he's appointed as assistant surveyor, and then he comes here and becomes surveyor general pretty quickly. But one of the first things he does is he gets landscape painting lessons from a master of this craft in England. So he comes ready to look at the landscape in a sort of receptive way, I think. And he is one of the first people to suggest that it really would be a good idea to find out the Indigenous names for the trees. He's also chopping a lot of them down, because to survey country, it's really nice if you can get a nice clear line of sight. There's a really simple way to achieve that. It's with an axe. But he also, like a lot of explorers of Australia, uses these, extraordinarily well-informed Indigenous guides who, strangely know all these tracks and all these water sources and goodness, as if they were familiar with the place. And he learns, though, through working with a lot of these guides in different, some quite positive relationships and a lot that are less so, but he learns which trees will show you where the water is and which trees will show you where the water isn't. And that's kind of a useful piece of landscape reading. So he is learning to read the landscape in different ways, while at the same time basically part of this massive enterprise to open up the whole continent as a big piece of real estate that people can come in and take pieces of. So it's a little bit complicated in that way as well.
It is. Thank you for that. Barren blue gum, which straight away made me think of Norman Lindsay, of course. But I'm really interested in the endeavours of the other botanist, Mr. Mueller. Is that how you say it? Who covered thousands of miles on horseback in South Australia, Western Australia, Victoria and New South Wales and Tasmania, but most impressively as a member of Augustus Gregory's North Australian expedition. But he has distinguished himself, as you say in the book, by once getting lost until 4 p.m. while completely absorbed in his plants, and another time by differentiating 30 different types of eucalypt on the spot. Perpetual motion he was in, I think, 16-hour days. But his pet tree was E. globulus, rather ugly name for the beautiful tree we know as the blue gum, and as children we knew because of bunyip blue gum, which I still read to my little ones. Can you give us a little bit of juicy stuff about Mr. Mueller and E. globulus?
There's a lot of juicy stuff about Mr. Mueller. One of the things that's so great about him, he is just evangelical about the blue gum. There is nothing that he doesn't think it can do. So he would like branches of it placed under hospital beds, because that will help people get better. And he does send, he's part of, in fact, he's the beginning of this sort of massive export of eucalypt seeds that starts this huge international planting frenzy of these trees in some of the most inappropriate places in the world. But he sends blue gum seeds off to some monks in a particularly dank and swampy part of Italy, where they've had a terrible problem with this disease called malaria, and they really don't have any idea what to do about it, because they predate Ronald Ross, who was going to tell them that it was something to do with the mosquitoes. So they think it's just to do with the damp soil, and he sends them these trees. They plant the eucalypts, which drain the swamps, which miraculously makes the malaria go away. And they're so impressed by this that they invent this liqueur, which uses the eucalypt, called eucalyptino. And I was very scathing about how utterly appalling that idea was, until, purely as a team building exercise, the Griffith Review team went to the gin school in Brisbane recently, and I put eucalyptus in my gin.
Ooh.
And it was great.
Oh.
So I'm going to have to revise the book again to not be so rude about the eucalyptino.
And to put gin recipes in it.
And to put gin recipes in it. But and Nigel Beebe might question that the eucalyptus was great in the gin, but he doesn't have a microphone, so it's all right.
We'll keep it
but Mueller was going to make cigars out of them. He sent them off to someone in Algeria who had this plan to reforest the entire Sahara. Like, what I love about a certain kind of gentleman in the late 19th century, there is no limit to their imagination. And this man genuinely thought he would just reforest the entire Sahara with eucalypts.
I'd say that's grandiosity, actually.
I think it's probably true, yeah.
Look, we've only got 10 minutes, so we're not going to be able to get through all of the chapters. So I'm going to run across Snugglepot and Cuddlepie now. I say this, and you just all have to run out and order the book, because, honestly, who doesn't want to read a chapter about May Gibbs and the art and how we look at it? I want to skip to Tasmania. I want to skip to Tasmania and a chapter called With the Giants. And I want to particularly do this in the context of my father lives in the south below the Huon Valley. And there was a couple of years ago where he was being threatened by fire, and they all had to go to the beach because they weren't going to be able to get out. And there are these trees down there which were breaking my heart at the time because they were in the direct line of fire. Can you talk a little bit about the tall trees of Tassie?
Tall trees of Tassie are beautiful, and one of the lovely things about coming back to the book and being able to update it 19 years later is that a lot of the trees that I wrote about that weren't protected when the book was first published now are. So that's great. But they are these, mighty 90+ metre tall things that have been growing for hundreds and hundreds of years. They are the most imposing and amazing creatures. We went down to see them in 2001. I don't know what the process is like now, but to get to, this was the Styx Valley, are the ones that I was writing about. And I was writing particularly about a man called Jeff Law, who worked for the Wilderness Society at that time. And it's Jeff's story that's sort of central to that chapter. But to get to the trees when we went down in 2001, you drove through the sections of the forest that had been clear felled. And it was like I imagine a World War I battlefield. There was just churned earth, and it was just earth. There was nothing. And the most shocking thing was there was no sound because there were no birds and there were no insects and there was nothing that, a breeze could move. And it was the most extraordinary landscape I've ever been in, and heartbreaking. And you drive around the corner and it is like entering the most sacred and extraordinary space. So I'm very pleased that those big trees are still there, and a lot of them are protected, and a lot of other protections have come into place in lots of parts of Tasmania. But the clear felling is something that we should all understand what it actually is and does to a landscape, I think, if we are to truly understand what's happening to our trees.
Can I just add to that some of those trees that haven't been knocked down, of course, are there because wonderful, wonderful people like the great late Peter Cundall got out there and put their bodies in front of dozers. Told me a story one day about doing just that, walking through the forest about 40 years ago in northern Tasmania, coming upon a clear felled acreage, and he and his wife literally just sitting down and crying. And then they got up and said, right, if you lot, we're going to fix this.
I might add to that, that one of the things about this chapter that I love is that you talk about how, people can only have empathy for something if we kind of personalise it. And so to give these trees a personality or a name somehow saves them, and the ones that aren't seen and named don't get saved. And I think that that's something that really touches on a real problem of our modern world, is that you can't, we can't generate empathy in things that we don't feel like we're family with.
Which I think is why, well, not just that beautiful quote from Jacqueline Troy of talking about the trees as mob, but also the work that people like Richard Powers has done in the Overstory, and that picks up on Susan Simard's work in North America, Peter Wollobin's work in Germany. There's an Australian researcher whose name I'm not going to pull out of my head now, but just this growing awareness of sentience and connection is incredibly important.
Can I just add very quickly one last question? Because it's about the fire chapter, which I think is a really, really important one. And I was going to ask you lots about this, Ash, but we haven't got time. But you do talk about eucalypt and fire having a dangerously cozy relationship. I love that description. And it's true, we've had catastrophic fire in this country since colonisation. I had great pleasure of spending some time with Victor Stephenson a couple of weeks ago and listening to him talk for a whole day about what we need to do for country. So easy, so easy. Of course, we don't listen and we don't do it. So you've detailed some really harrowing scenes and situations in this book. What did you come away after writing this section about fire? What did you come away with yourself personally?
The fire chapter is a really interesting one because when I started working on the book, which I think was in 2000, I was going to use the fires from 1994, I think, which had been pretty massive. They were going to be the fire chapter. And then while I was working on the book, there were the fires of the Christmas 2001 going into 2002, which did enormous damage in the Blue Mountains, which had been designated a World Heritage Area. I think the line was, it was a living laboratory for eucalypts. So in a really callous journalistic way, I went, oh, that's handy, isn't it? I'll just use those fires instead. And that was, that was lovely to be able to bring that into the book. Now, the problem coming back to look at the book at the beginning of 2000 and what year is it? 21, was the small matter of the summer of 2019, 2020, and trying to work out whether I just would completely remove the chapter that had been there and do something new, and that looked at that next enormous leap in magnitude that fire was taking now. And yes, all the knowledge about country is important, but then there is the climate change factor, which means that these fires are bigger and more ferocious and more dangerous, and we are likely to have more of them more often. And that's just sobering. So I'm really conscious that the 2001, 2002 fires now, they are still very dramatic, and the story is still very dramatic, but we are in a whole new story now, and a whole new landscape in that way. A lot of the eucalypts do depend on fire somehow to regenerate one way or another, but a lot of them, these fires are too hot and they come too often, and so they will damage them and they can kill them. And that's a new space for eucalypts to find themselves in, and that's a really important thing to think about.
It's and the implications of this book are so current. It's so contemporary. When I finished this, I was like, of course, this book needs to come back now, because even the genetics about trees needing the genetic inheritance that they have, and how you can tell so much about climate change from the genetics of trees is amazing. But we can't go on about it because we want you guys to ask some questions now. So if you're on Zoom, you can type your questions into the chat function. And if you're in the audience, you can raise your hand if you have a question for Ash. Yeah.
Can I stand up?
Yeah.
Yes. I read your book because my dear daughter gave it to me for Christmas with great interest. I'm looking forward to reading second edition. But I'd just like to make two little statements about, or to recount two personal relationships with guns. As a child, I grew up on properties out west. And as a child, we would drive past acres and acres of those ghostly rumbar trees. And my stepfather was a ringbarker. And he'd say, oh, hasn't so-and-so really improved his property? Look at all that ringbark he's been doing. And so recently, I was very surprised to hear that my half-brother, who is that stepfather's son, has on his farm trees all around the edges of his farm paddocks. And instead of chopping them down, because they do are phytotoxic and they do absorb the water, he has a machine that cuts the roots that go into the paddock, and there's some brown. That is amazing. And he said to me, I cried when my stepfather went up the paddock and chopped down the trees. And I never knew this about my brother until last year. And I too used to cry, and still do, when trees are chopped. So I know what his Christmas present is.
I'm not sure if there's. Basically, it was just about a personal story about instead of chopping down the trees, to use them, at the edges of your property and at the edges of your paddocks, and that is, a much better way of doing it, and a great Christmas present for you.
And I think too, there's something lovely in, there's the work of Charlie Massey, who does all the work in regenerative agriculture, and that's a really that's a really nice reintroduction of lots of those kinds of knowledge, and so many farmers who have those stories of their own childhood and their own distress at what was happening and what they were told was the right thing to do, and understanding that there's a different way of doing it. So that's hopeful. I'm going for my question in the front row.
I was just
Do you want to
going,
use the microphone? Because I can give it to you.
There you go.
I was just going to say you missed a good quip about taxonomy and the not so gum leaves.
Oh, the not so gummy.
Sorry, I did. I'm not thinking fast enough. Apologies for my low comedic value.
Very good.
Make up for it in literary.
Thanks, Joe.
Are there any,
Quote unquote.
yeah. Are there questions from Zoom? Oscar, are there any questions?
Yeah, we've had one. Rebecca Claire Page asks, is there or will there be an audiobook available?
Oh,
Audiobook.
I don't know, is my short answer. If there was, we'd be able to get it to people slightly more reliably than we can currently get paperbacks. But I think we should do it just for that reason alone.
If you are joining us from Townsville, there are quite a lot of books over there, so go to your local bookseller.
Buy half a dozen.
Oh. There's a question back here.
I read your book a number of years ago after you came to it, and I then, when I finished it, I literally turned it over and started again because of the sheer amount of information, and I could not imagine how many hours and hours of reading that you spent to research the book. Absolutely phenomenal. But I wanted to just know from you, is there a particular gum that is special to you?
Is there a gum that is special to you is the question.
I think the loveliest thing about writing this book and the enormous privilege of being able to explore the eucalypts the first time and then come back to them this time is that it means having a relationship with any gum that I meet. So I can think of, when you drive into Brown Lake on Minjerribah, there are amazing gums there and I love those. But then I also, in the climate change and genetics chapter, there's a section about, what's the day called? National Tree Planting Day. And I can't remember how many years ago it was that I wrote that essay, but Hux and I planted a gum tree in our front yard. And so I'm also very fond of that one. And they're taller than me and Hux put together.
That's not saying much.
Hux is taller than me. And then there's trees where I grew up, where my mum and dad live in Austinmere. There's a lot of beautiful eucalypts down there, but I grew up thinking, and this is why I won't give Krissy and Kneen a hard time about the leaves, I grew up thinking that the turpentines that were down there were eucalypts, and they're not. The snow gums are amazing. The rainbow gums are amazing. Those trees in Tasmania, there's no. I found the other week when Hux was playing sport somewhere out, I think it was near Oxley somewhere, there was just this little, just like a little grove is too storybook a word, but just this really lovely patch of gum trees that, must have been old and were big, and there were about 6 or 7 different species growing in there. And that was just a really special place to find on a Saturday morning. So I'm glad that I get to be excited by all of them, although it makes me a bit busy.
Question here.
Ash, I haven't read the book, but I'm looking forward to it. But I am interested in what you just danced around was the new information and the fact that what I grew up, that all gums were eucalypts and that was just how it is. What's the new information and how do you bring that into the story?
So the question goes to the heart of a long argument in systematic botany, which is what gets to be a eucalypt and what doesn't. So there were lots of things whose genus name was eucalyptus, and around the mid to late 90s, some botanists at the Sydney Botanic Gardens decided there were too many of them and that there were points of difference. There's, upwards of 700 of these things. So it's reasonable to think you might be able to make them a bit more manageable. And so they decided that there would be the eucalypt group, but they would split it into 3 genera. Is that the plural? Thank you, scientists. The eucalyptus, the angophora, and the corymbia. So a large part of the copy editing of this version of the book was me and the lovely production editor at New South working out when things' names change. So did we have it in a chapter where it was still eucalyptus something or other, or was it in a chapter when it had become corymbia something or other? I think everyone's settled down now. The next thing is going to be whether the genetics display or reveal that there are actually far fewer distinct species than we thought, and maybe a lot of what we're calling different species are just different morphologies in terms of size and shape. But that's in the 3rd edition.
Fantastic. I was very also interested that you did mention fungus briefly and their codependency with eucalypts. Thank you very much, Ashley, for that. Can't go to trees without talking about what's underneath them and in them. There was one question at the back there.
Hi, Ash. What sort of education or experiences do you think we should be giving to the younger generations so they get the best of both worlds? So the enlightenment, taxonomy, systematization, but also the life of nature. We can live in the modern world, but also not cutting all the trees.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely question about how we bring together the two ways of apprehending the trees, I guess, the science and the nature and the older sort of knowledges of it. And I think one of the things that strikes me about Australia is, this is the country with the oldest continuing civilization. We're in a unique position in the world to have at our disposal all of the scientific methodologies that help us understand things like climate change and help us understand help us model and help us project and help us, unravel genetics and help us ask questions, really important questions in different ways and ways that are critical to what we need to know now. But we are also in the presence of this extraordinary bank of understanding and experience. I mean, just being out and paying attention to the trees, whether you're doing that with someone who says, I want to tell you this is this genus and this is this, here's how you look at the bark and here's why the leaves have this vein and whatever, or whether it's a person saying I'm a custodian of this particular knowledge and I want to share this story with you. Being out there and paying attention to the trees is the kind of thing in common, and I think we've got a different opportunity to do that in Australia, which is really wonderful and valuable.
I would have loved to have had one of those apps when I was collecting my leaves, so you could just point at the tree. Leaf Shazam, that's exactly it. I've got a mushroom Shazam, but I don't have a leaf Shazam. There's one more question. We might have to wrap up there.
Thank you. I wanted to address the idea of the importance of individual trees. And you're talking before about naming them. And I was just thinking about how some of the trees I know of, that are very old, are very big.
Mm.
And eucalyptus don't grow that big. So I was up at Noosa recently and a friend there showed me a tree that she said, this is over 1,000 years old. That they're so slow growing compared to some other trees. And I haven't seen much of that, in the common knowledge about, because we look at this, sort of scrubby landscape, but there may be trees that are so much older than we know. And I just wanted to ask you, because I don't know much about it, but
Yeah.
appreciation when something is,
if something, so I think the idea that the trees have to be big for us to notice them, or sort of, blockbuster somehow. And certainly those trees in Tasmania and in the mountain ash in Victoria and the karri and the jarrah in Western Australia, they're mighty. But the one that I really love, and I haven't seen it, is a really highly endangered tree, it's a mallee over on the west coast of Australia, and it's 6,000 years old, and it's one of the oldest living organisms, and it's not really that much to look at. In fact, half of it, because it's a mallee, it sort of spreads, you know, with a common sort of rootstock, and half of it was going to be chopped out for a car park to be put in because no one thought it was anything important. Anyway, that didn't happen. But the fact that it can be, it's almost protected by its unremarkableness up to a point, because you can't just look at it and go 6,000 years old, you know, we're back around, where are we, earlier than the pyramids? Yes. So that, I mean, I think that's part of what's so fascinating, is that we make these presumptions about the size and the age, and I don't think you should make any presumptions about things in a continent like Australia.
Absolutely.
I found the quote that Ash allegedly said, and I lost. I thought it might be a nice way to round it off, actually. Describing this book, Ms. Hay said, gum is about a magical, mythical, medicinal tree of new worlds, strange people, and big ideas. Couldn't have said it better ourselves, could we?
Absolutely, that is perfect. Yeah, we're going to go to Ash to do some thank yous now. But as I said, you know, we really apologise that 3 versions of the book stock for tonight are still stuck in various places in Australia. But we will eventually get 3 times the amount that we normally order for an event arriving, and it'll just be gum and nothing else in this bookshop. So in anticipation of that moment, after Ash does her thank yous, we will be taking orders for the book, and Ash will come back and spend a day like Trent Dalton will just have to usher you in and spend a whole day signing 12,000 copies of the book that just turned up. So
Buy one for every member of your family.
Yeah, that's right.
Do the Zoom people stay on
They
now?
often do. They're here now. Do you want
Great.
me, or do you want me to kick them off?
No. It's just because of the small matter of a border between New South Wales and Queensland. There were just some people I know are in Zoom world that I wanted to make sure were still here. I would like to thank all of you very, very much for being here in the room or in the other world with me tonight. I have to say, I've never felt less prepared for anything. The state of my mind, it was only 10 minutes before I got here that I thought, oh shit, I better actually prepare something, because it wasn't a Griffith Review book, and because I wasn't facilitating the conversation, hadn't even occurred to me that I might have to.
Don't need to. That's our job.
Anyway, I just jotted a couple of things down. So as I said, this version of the book appeared sort of quite accidentally in this rather crazy busy year. It was out of the impetus of the Eucalyptus exhibition, which did give me the strange moment of feeling a bit like a eucalyptic rock star. And that exhibition was supposed to open in July of this year. It got installed and then Sydney shut down. So I want to run just through some thank yous really, really quickly to the original team at Duffy and Snellgrove who helped me make this book 20 years ago almost. Michael Duffy, who was the publisher, and Gail McCallum, who was the editor, or in fact, I think she was technically my publisher for that one. I want to thank her particularly because she is still here 20 years later, and I need to thank her for work on this version as well. And I would like particularly to thank Sarah Rees and Agatha Gertis-Snape at the Powerhouse Museum for scooping me into the amazing group of people that they commissioned new work from for this show. I would really like to say thank you to all the people I'd interviewed in 2000 and 2001, who, when I contacted them and said, the book is coming out again, are you happy for me to go with it again? They were all so supportive and so excited, and that was really lovely to know that the book still had some currency for them. And a massive thank you to the New South team, to Kathy Bale and Elspeth Menzies, to Caitlin and Annie, who've been doing incredible things with publicity, to Emma Hutchinson with her extraordinary patience and forbearance for a writer who just keeps revising and revising and has a really liquid sense of deadlines because she knows how they work from the other side. And particularly for literally ringing the printer and saying, stop the press because we got the beautiful endorsement from Tony Birch 5 minutes after they'd sent the book to be printed. So I would very much like to thank Emma for her patience and forbearance around that. I'd like to thank Tony and Holly Ringland and Sophie Cunningham and James Bradley, who were so generous towards this new edition, and also Auntie Fran Bodkin, who gave me permission to use the Darrell Wool story at the beginning of the book, gave me permission to use it again in this edition, and who, in the conversation that I had with her after 20 years, we had a bit to catch up on, gave me the most amazing story to put into the end of the book as well, which was just exciting. I'd like to thank the Griffith Review team for dealing with an editor who was slightly more harried than usual, which I don't think they would have thought was possible. I'd like to thank Krissy, Kneen and Chris Olsson for everything as always, and Avid for having us because they're important. But most importantly, I would like to thank Nigel Beebe, who was there for the ride for the first edition and the second one, and Huxley Beebe, who got dragged into this one and was very obliging. I'd particularly like to thank them because they thought I was busy enough before I started rewriting this, and they were very patiently came along on eucalyptus spotting hunts with me. So the Powerhouse show was installed to open on the 1st of July. Sydney shut down, and I imagined it sitting there like Miss Havisham's, you know, like treasure for all that time. I still haven't seen it, which feels really weird. It is open now. I can't wait, but I love the idea of it shimmering down there waiting for me, having opened up this extraordinary opportunity for me and this extraordinary opportunity for this book to have another life. Thank you all so much for coming along.
In lieu of a signing, unless there are a few people with a copy in their hands, there may be a couple of people who managed to get one before the end. We will be taking orders for the book, or you can definitely call us and order it if you would rather. And also,